Do you like books? I mean, really, really like books? Then you're in the right place. Each week, your host, Sam Hankin, interviews the best of today's top-selling authors and the up-and-coming superstars of modern literature. This is The Avid Reader. Here is your host, Sam Hankin.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of The Avid Reader, brought to you by Wellington Square Bookshop. Our guests today are Lewis Cohen, Paul Summergrad, and John David Forsgren. We're going to be having a conversation about Lou's latest book, Winter's End, Dementia and Dying Well. It was published by Oxford University Press, my favorite press, and released in July. This is Lou's third book related to why people choose to hasten their deaths and to try to understand the various factors promoting or preventing this option. He's an advisor to the Completed Life Initiative, and he brings a lot of expertise to psychiatric aspects of end-of-life care. His research helped found the subspecialty of renal palliative care. I have stage 3A renal chronic kidney disease by integrating nephrology and palliative medicine. And Paul is right now the Francis Arkin Professor and Chairman of the Department of Psychiatry and at Tufts University. And he served as the President of the American Psychiatric Association as well. John, who I'm so glad joined us today, was trained as an architect. He's an artist whose pen and ink drawings form a lot of the book's illustrations. Illustrations and the notes are really helpful, and we can get to that. Arguably, among the worst of all medical afflictions, and I've seen it, are the dementias, which, and it's interesting that they're plural. I had never heard of them that way, and we'll talk about that. They slowly destroy your personality. They take this tremendous emotional toll, and for many, financial toll on not only the patients, but the families. And that's how I was aware of all this. Plus, they're irreversible and pretty much always fatal. So Winter's End, Dementia and its Life-Shortening Options, is constructed around interviews with John, interviews with Dan, who we'll meet, but lots of other people, such as medical practitioners, legal scholars, bioethicists, social workers, and a lot more. So the book explores how and when might prepare to foreshorten life after being diagnosed. Dan Winter was one of the exceptions about not ignoring the reality of what was happening. And after being diagnosed with early onset, he resolved to hasten his death, and that's what our story is about. So anyway, not to go on and on like I do, it's intended, the book, to catalyze these conversations, and it's, provocative and also, I guess, spellbinding, which it was to me. And it's still a taboo subject, but because we're all here of a certain age, it's germane to us because it's probable that one of us may be in the situation that Dan found himself in. So welcome, guys. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Sure.
So
let me just so that I know, because this will go out into the world, and I wouldn't want it to be.
I know I screwed up.
That's okay, not a problem. I used to be the Arkin Professor and Chair of the Department of Psychiatry at Tufts until June of 2023. I now have a wonderful successor, Brent Forrester, who's actually a dementia expert, and perhaps would get engaged in one of these conversations in the future. And I'm now Chairman Emeritus and Professor of Psychiatry and Medicine at Tufts.
Got it. Well, as a bookseller, I'm always interested in the cover, as is every person who comes into the bookstore, because they judge the book by its cover. It's a great cover. And talk about who did it and how it arose. It gives you an idea of the cacophony of the disease, and it definitely draws you in. So what about the cover?
Lou,
John?
do you want to start, Lou?
I'll start as long as I can hand the ball over to you.
Sure.
Which is, I did a series of interviews that went on for 9 months that took place with Dan Winter and his husband, John Forsgren. And they were all done on the telephone. So we were not looking at each other the way we are right now, although John and Dan were both kind enough to send me some photographs. And among them were some works that John was creating. And one of them in particular popped out for me. It had this kind of crazy neurological EEG squiggly kind of look to it. I asked him, and he was kind enough to let us use it as the cover. But maybe, John, you can sort of say what your own thoughts are, maybe what it was intended to be originally.
Well, I was especially happy to have you request that. I began to do this kind of artwork in 2016, and it was all made possible by Dan Winter. We had been traveling to lots and lots of museums, and I came to one piece of work done by one of the women of the abstract expressionist movement. And it really inspired me to come back home and buy canvas and India ink. And I began to produce hundreds of pieces in using various experimental techniques. And this piece is of one specific technique and was completely abstract at the time. It didn't have any special meaning for me. It was simply another way of moving the ink around the canvas. So none of my pieces come from an emotional place, intellectual only in that they are experiments in how to move ink around without using brushes or pens or anything other than gravity, actually.
It's funny because Lou mentioned neurons, and I interviewed somebody who had written a book about Santiago Ramon y Cajal, and his pictures of neurons, which are painstaking and done, well over a century ago, reminded me so much of the cover of this book. You just got to look him up. Santiago Ramon y Cajal, send his name, because you should look at the cover of the book about him. It's almost exactly the same.
Wow.
And you have to look at it. Anyway.
Yeah,
and Sam, one more piece. Did you happen to notice on the cover the little blue flower?
Yes.
Yeah, that was my addition. I
didn't notice it the first time. And you got to remember, I had a galley, so I would go back to the cover, which looked like it, but sometimes in the galley, it doesn't start with the cover. Anyway.
Happen to know what the flower is?
No.
It's a forget-me-not.
That was one of my questions, actually. For all you guys, when you were talking about like Terry Pratchett and other guys who have died because of the dementias, whether planned or not planned, I still think of Terry Pratchett all the time because I love his books with Neil Gaiman and all the books he's written. So I still think about him. And if we go to the concept of death, and I'm going to ask you your opinions about death itself. Obviously, John, you think about Dan probably every day.
Yeah.
Do you feel as if you're keeping him alive by thinking about him? Like that saying about when the last person stops thinking about somebody, that's when they really die?
That's a phrase that has stayed with me ever since I learned about it. I don't remember how long ago that was. No, I don't really think about it as keeping him alive, keeping his memory alive, certainly. But he was just so fully integrated in every aspect of my life. We both were, that there's very little that goes on during the course of a day where some experience I had with Dan, or some different way that he did things than me, and hundreds of ways. Every time I pet the dog, which I'm doing right now, I think of Dan, because we only have a dog because of Dan. So
is it still Friday?
It's still Friday.
How old is Friday?
Friday turned 11 this month.
Wow. And is he a Labradoodle?
She is a Labradoodle, a medium Labradoodle. Yeah.
That's a long life. Interesting. So I was going to ask you, Lou, and then all three of you, I guess the question, I mean, because the book is surrounded and surrounds death, and also because I'm a bookseller, I'm always interested in the epigraphs. And the one epigraph about the Catholic Mass for the Dead really, really struck me. And I'm wondering, and maybe Paul, you can start first because we come from this from the outside. What do you guys think of death itself? Do you think of it as something that ends things? Do any of you feel like, when I read the epigraph, that it goes beyond the last breath, the last thought? How do you guys feel? Because you have to be thinking about it, because that's what you're writing about. What happens after this process ends?
Yeah, so it's a really, first of all, it's wonderful to talk with a bookseller, as well as as John and Lou, who I've known for many years. But you know, it's just thinking of seeing you in this picture with the books behind you. You know, a bookseller of the traditional type, in other words, not a chain, not something that's just simply happening online. It's so much more than just somebody who happens to have a lot of books that are, you know, it's a curator. You know, you make decisions about what you'll host, what you won't host in your store, and obviously there are economic and other, but you know, you're somebody who is imbued with and living with books. So I'm very honored to have a chance to be able to join, you know, you for this conversation.
That means a lot.
So I've been thinking about death a lot recently. I would say probably over the last several years. Now, part of that has to do with having just turned 75, and you know, having not terrible health issues, but some health issues. You know, and even without having health issues, one doesn't have to go very far without, you know, being aware of this. And you know, I guess I have a different perspective as a physician and as a psychiatrist than I do as a person. As a physician, I'm kind of agnostic about this. I'm empirical. It's you know, I've watched people die, you know, from, you know, in greater or lesser degrees over the last, you know, 50 plus years of my life, ever since I was a medical student. You know, sometimes it has been profoundly disturbing. You know, I remember a young person. Again, you know, these things are many years ago. I don't want to, you know, give away things that could be identifying. A young person who was dying of metastatic melanoma, and you know, I remember hearing this person scream in the middle of the night, you know, piercing scream, "I don't want to die," and they were indeed dying and died that. You know, or watching young people, you know, or older people. I mean, I remember people, you know, I'd see people come into, before we had all the interventions that we have now. You know, you're a relatively young person as a physician, and you don't think a lot about death. It's not the kind of thing you think about at 25 or 28 to the same degree. But to watch people come in and go from health to death in hours, sometimes in minutes, is just, you know, it's a very, so, you know, and then people are there and they're in a post-mortem state, and indeed that's how you get introduced to you know, to medicine, is through the experience with cadavers. I mean, I will never forget, just this is public, so this is a movie that gets produced. The University of California, Los Angeles, when I was a medical student, the University of California, Los Angeles produced movies of how to do dissections, or what they would call prosections, of a particular part of a body, of a cadaver. And I remember the first thing we started with was just my first day of medical school. And the first thing we were doing was doing the pectoral region, the chest. And this was in Los Angeles. And there was this nude woman who could not have been more than 25, who looked for all the world like she was a starlet, had moved to Los Angeles and they were dissecting her chest. And how do you deal with that? How do you deal with, that as a phenomenon? So on the one hand, there's a part of me that feels like it's very much a finality. And certainly from the experience on this side, it is. And then there's another part of me that, there's a book called the Pirkei Avot, the Sayings of the Fathers, which is a very ancient Jewish Talmudic text. And as it happens, I've been preoccupied with one particular section of that. I think it's 420 in that text, about that the grave is not a refuge for you, because you will have to account. He is the judge, he is the witness, he is the prosecutor, he is the determiner, and you will have to answer for your life. And so there's a part of me that feels like, I don't know whether that's a wish that I want that to be true, but there's a part of me that feels like something goes on after this, and that may be completely untrue, but there's something resonant about it. So I'm all over the place with this, and I have no element of certainty about any of it.
John, I mean, Paul was talking about the traumatic experience of someone who's young, and we should go further into the book right now, but let me ask you about, you've been and have been around AIDS and helping people who have it. So kind of like Paul was saying about, and we're not getting into the older people, but when you see young people who one day are healthy and a month later are dead, that's the same kind of thing he was talking about.
Yeah.
So briefly, what was your experience and what is your experience helping these people?
Well, my experience was, traumatic from day one. The first time I read about this syndrome that was being seen in men in San Francisco, I happened to have a new roommate. This was 1981, who was upstairs in the house as I was reading this, having all the symptoms of the early stages of what became AIDS. And so, and he died probably 18 months to 2 years later. So it was immediately real to me. The other part that became immediately real was the cruelty that exists within us, that we can aim at our family members. The vast majority of the first men that I knew who died were all rejected by their families. So it was at once, I was filled with fear, and I began to, as I learned about other people who were positive or symptomatic, holding at the same time this reality of the need for us as a community to care for each other, because of the choices that families made then, particularly about their gay siblings and sons.
Let's turn back to who the most.
Sam, could I cut in with two things?
Sure, go ahead.
The first being that I think Dan Winter was one of the luckiest human beings to walk this earth, because of having had the opportunity to marry John, because you can hear how John's early experience with death was such that it made him the perfect partner to go through with what Dan ultimately went through, and to be supportive. But the other thing I'd like to do is to read, if you don't mind, that very brief quote that you liked, because I think that, I chose it because it caught what I wanted to, what I think about. It's by John Leroux, who was a writer and a poet, and had published an essay in the New Yorker magazine in which he said, "In the service for the dead, the Catholic Church Ask God to grant us all eternal rest. There's little fuss about heaven or its glories, no fuss at all about hell, just eternal rest. And after all the words squandered on right and wrong, failure and desire, love and the tragic failure to love, I am ready for eternal rest. Eternal rest, even the sound is soothing. And this was published. John Leroux received assisted dying for Parkinson's disease at his request.
It's interesting that the Catholic Church, which totally rejects exactly what you guys wrote about in the book, is the epigraph you chose. And the way I look at epigraphs is, you look at a jigsaw puzzle box, and the cover is what everything's going to look like inside when it's put together. But the cover is like an epigraph, because it gives you an idea of what's going to happen when you read the book. And it actually, that's a really great quote for it. It's the concept of eternal rest. And I guess in this book, we should talk more about Dan, about how he got there, how he got to the point, because he changed. You, John, and Dan had to go through a process, and Lou explains it perfectly, almost a metamorphosis of what he wanted to do, how he was going to do it, and when he finally did it. And you having to be there for the entire time, especially poignantly at the end when Friday is there and you're there and Dan is kind of there. So maybe you could go through a little bit of that, which will give us more context, and then we'll move on as quickly as we can, because there's so much to cover.
One of the first trips that I took with Dan to Kansas City, where he had lived before he moved to Portland, we went and visited his father, who was in late stages, relatively late stage of Alzheimer's at the time. And that visit made a tremendous impact on both Dan and me. His father was unable to speak, unable to recognize, unable to do any kind of communication whatsoever. The only thing that he seemed to be interested in was the oak leaves that had fallen, and he would look at one oak leaf and put it down, pick up another one and look at it with this look of awe. But that was the extent of his humanness. Dan said that visit.
Well, John, if I could add to that.
Sure.
Among the details you guys told me that jumped out, I mean, and Dan's father was a larger than life person. He was a state senator for a couple of terms. He was an entrepreneur. He was a cattle rancher. And during this visit, when he's walking around outside, among the things you notice is that he's not wearing any shoes. He's barefoot out there. Plus, he doesn't recognize at this point, he's not able to recognize you or most poignantly, his son.
Yeah.
It's funny because, the way you describe him so well, because of John, he's a vibrant guy, big, larger than life. The cool thing about him is he was a pain in the ass also. And I don't want to die not being a pain in the ass. I've spent all my life perfecting being a pain in the ass, and I don't want to lose that. And I bet you everyone probably missed that too.
Well, if you need a role model, Wint would be your perfect role model. He was virtually a professional pain in the ass. And while we smile and laugh about it, he was also capable of enormous cruelty, tormenting Dan at his lack of athletic ability and teasing him that he couldn't throw a ball and that he threw like a girl, and
My dad said that.
things that made lasting impressions on Dan.
Well, and I know, and we don't need to talk about the trauma that Dan had, because there's much more important things to talk about. But going back to my question is like, okay, he made this decision, and the way you describe it, Lou, is that decision was made because of his dad and because he knew what was going to happen. He made a decision, and the rest of the book and your interviews are all about the logistics of it, which I think are very important, because as this population gets older, the logistics are the most important part after you make that actual decision.
Yeah. I mean, this book is written for people like myself, certainly like Dan, who have witnessed the ravages that dementia makes on people, on their families, on society and the like. And it's sort of, I mean, the question that I asked myself is, so in the Boy Scout model to be prepared, we can be prepared that we may get this, that we will get this, like in likelihood if we live long enough. But what can we do? What did Dan serve as a model of in terms of attempting to take control over how he was going to live the end of his life?
Exactly. Well, tell me about it, John or Lou.
Well, one of the advantages that Dan and I were aware of meeting at the ages that we were, I was 61 when we met. Dan's was 8 years younger than me. So we'd both been around the block, and I had certainly learned a lot about watching other people face death, young people because of AIDS, grandparents, my own parents. My father was a physician. Illness and death were dinner table conversation. My mother was a nurse. So in the half hour each evening that we had my dad, he would discuss his patients. So death was something that was nothing to be terribly ashamed of or afraid of. It was something that happened.
Where did you grow up?
Southern Oregon, Grants Pass.
So was that a more rural area or populated, or?
It was, Grants Pass was a town of just under 10,000 people when I left it in 1969.
Wow.
It was a town of 4,000 when I was born. And farming, farming and lumber were the industries that it serviced. Anyway, so I came to the AIDS experience having death be something that I wasn't taught to be afraid of. I spent a number of years talking about living with HIV disease, which gave me the comfort level of talking about intimate, personal, otherwise traumatic things. And Dan made it very clear to me that he found real inspiration in that. And so we taught each other a lot about the end of life. Because he was dealing with it at age 58 when he was diagnosed, and my having a longer, somewhat more abstract experience with it.
Well, okay. To continue, let's start from the time he makes the decision and move forward. And Lou and Paul, jump in. Where are we that he can even make that decision? Because as a layman reading this, I'm thinking, you can't do this in the United States. You can do it abroad. I thought about executions and how people died. I thought about the Nembutal that the one woman ordered, and it seems so simple. I thought about putting my cat to sleep and how gentle it was and easy. And then I thought about this long, convoluted process and changed your mind as to the timing and the manner of this. So give me a thumbnail sketch of that until the end, if you can, if you want to.
Well,
yeah, please.
Go ahead, Lou. You interviewed Dan about this, so you may have a different perspective. I'll be glad to talk about it more as well. But
I may be. I mean, I think there are a lot of people who see somebody who's demented and they walk away saying, "I'd rather be dead."
Yeah.
The 13 years that Dan's father had this disease was sufficiently excruciating that I think Dan came away with that conviction. And so he was prepared when he received the diagnosis that he wasn't going to do it his father's way. He was going to do it his own way. He was going to hasten his death. And what he quickly discovered, and this is something your audience needs to know, and you're basically saying it, which is in this country where there are now 12 different communities that have legalized voluntary assisted dying or medical assistance in dying, none of those in the United States include people who have dementias. They are all excluded. Now, they are included in some of the European countries that have similar laws. They are included in those. And as you said, people could hop on a plane after providing a lot of background information and go to Switzerland, for example, having made arrangements for such a death. But that was not in the cards, and Dan knew that. What he also, though, did know, and he had explored this before I came on the scene, is that there are some right to die organizations populated with volunteers who you can reach out to. Final Exit is the name of one of them that Dan reached out to at one point, who will provide you with information, with education, and with certainly emotional support in taking your life, in shortening your life. And so there are books out there as well that will explain to different degrees with authority or not authority what one can do. I was curious as a psychiatrist, of course, and have been all along, where does suicide, as I know it, going to people's bedsides who'd made suicide attempts and are now, they didn't die and they're now being evaluated by me as a psychiatrist. Where do they leave off and somebody like Dan begin? Because Dan was radically different from the depressed people who I've encountered in the hospital, to which I would turn to Paul perhaps and maybe get his take to sort of tease that out.
Yeah, there is certainly, there are so many connections here. So for example, part of the reason why I asked John about where he grew up and his experience, with his dad being in mom both being in healthcare, is that, the reality is that death was a commonplace in the United States, not just in rural areas, but certainly in rural areas through much of the 20th century. People died of all sorts of illnesses. It's infectious diseases in particular, taking young people, but it was not, and also animals died, other beings died. It was not something that was hermetically sealed off from, your meat supply or your day-to-day experience. And we have an extraordinary healthcare system that enables us to, tend, repair, do all sorts of things for people that even 30 or 50 years ago, it's one of the reasons why, just to go a little bit afield for a second, why the reproductive freedom question is so intense, because it's not really just a question of reproductive freedom. It's also a question of people's lives and their ability to get healthcare. Healthcare is so complicated and so nuanced that, the idea that somebody's going to come in and regulate that externally and tell, physicians what they're supposed to do at the bedside with a complicated situation where, they may have seen one in their lives or two, it seems, and it's so discontinuous from how much we can do around so many things. So we're so used, on the one hand, to doing an enormous amount. And certainly, within the framework of suicide, no physician in the United States, to the best of my knowledge, was ever sued for malpractice for a patient who died by suicide before 1953 in the United States. That's my understanding. And part of the reason for that was suicide was a criminal act. It was part of the reason why people don't like to use the term committed suicide, because committed suicide has the valence of committed a crime. That's where the committed comes in to some degree, that you've taken an action that's illegal. So, certainly we've all taken care of people who have had intense suicidality, where have made attempts, not made attempts, but where with treatment, they could come back and say, oh my God, I can't believe I was in that state of being. Or where people will describe, surviving a suicide attempt and saying, I realized that I really wanted to live and that there really were solutions to my problems. So we're used to this kind of more medicalized, historically criminalized, interventional kind of a mindset. At the same time, the reality is every day in hospitals, people are making decisions apart from the legal system based on who's your healthcare proxy, who's your next of kin, do we continue, do we not continue, based on the judgment of whoever the treating physicians and nurses may happen to be, where people are sometimes more accelerated and sometimes more slowly brought to death, and where there are decisions that people make that can be seen not that completely discontinuous from what you're describing here. Obviously there are important differences, but
Well,
in one sense, I think there's much more of this going around. There's much more where people will make decisions to pull back care or not intervene or to assist people in hospice or other circumstances than I think we probably ordinarily give credit to.
well, what about Lou? You taken a moment in the book to describe, not that you were hamstrung, but to describe your ethical and moral dilemma and making sure that you didn't talk to Dan in such a way as you might be breaching one of your ethical duties. And what would those breaches have been? And would they have actually been helpful to Dan, do you think?
Yeah. Well, they did not take away my medical license when I retired, which I did a few years ago. And so a big part of my identity still remains as a physician. And I also know a lot about the stuff that one can do to end your life. So take Dan, for example, he collected a whole bunch of medication, having spoken to some folk from a Right to Die organization. And it was sort of, I wanted to know about what he had in mind, and there was part of me that I couldn't escape, the physician part of me that also was hesitant to hear the details of it. I saw myself primarily, though I tried to put aside the physician piece and just see myself as an embedded reporter. Almost in a combat zone. I was not supposed to pick up a gun and start shooting people. And likewise, with Dan, I saw myself as trying to just follow his story and to communicate it as honestly as I could. But it did, as you point out, Sam, it raised for me some ethical concerns that I didn't anticipate.
Well, it's interesting that, you talk about a collection of medications and you might have thought, well, maybe you should alter that a bit or do this to it. And
Yep.
then, John, for a long time, that was the way that Dan was ready to pick a date, pick a place, and it was also in a very unusual time in our country. But then, and this is what fascinated me more than anything about the book, was he changed his mind about how he was going to go about it. And in my mind, he did it, I would think, in a much more difficult way. But the way Lou portrays it, it didn't seem nearly as difficult as I thought it would be. So describe this idea. Well, first of all, I think it may have had a lot to do with his family, but the method in which he chose to end this experience that we call life was by voluntarily stopping eating and drinking.
Yeah, that his ability to switch from a pharmaceutical end to stopping eating and drinking showed his commitment to ending his life. he announced at the beginning of 2020 that that would be the last year of his life. The symptoms were beginning to accumulate and accumulate more quickly. And then, of course, the pandemic hit. And so we had this very intense period of time where we were basically alone, which another subject possibly, which was joyous and filled with humor. When it came around to the, after he'd made the decision, the disease was exhausting. For him to talk to anybody on the phone, he would hang up and just hold his head in his hands. He had to work so hard to be Dan Winter. So there was, the disease was present and evident in every interaction that he had other than with me. I may have exhausted him too. But it was the family's response, many members of the family who could not support his decision to end his life. Never mind that he had told them in December of 2017, when he got his diagnosis, that that's how he would be ending his life.
It's interesting that you, Lou, brought up Lisa Genova and Still Alice, because I interviewed her in 2014 about that book. Yeah. And cognitively, she was really smart because she wrote this list of how she would have to go about it. And she didn't want to get past the point where she couldn't understand or remember the list of what she intended to do. And then, as you say, the pills scattered on the floor, and then she forgot what she was doing. I was thinking, when you were talking to Dan and you, John, describing him, did he ever lose so much of his cognitive ability that he didn't know what he was going to do, how he was going to do it? Did you remind? Did you always know?
He always knew. And when he told me his diagnosis on the same day that he got his diagnosis, he told me what he was going to do, and I told him that I fully supported his decision, but I also wanted to make clear that he could change his mind if he wanted. I wasn't going to try to change his mind, but I would remind him periodically that he could change his mind if he wanted to. And we had that kind of conversation within days and weeks and days of his death. And he never wavered one second. So his commitment to ending his life was so thorough, and he was so certain that there wasn't anything that was gonna, and that was the timing. He began to be afraid that there could be a day in the near future when he would lose that ability.
And Lou, it's interesting because, John's talking about total commitment, yet less than half the people who decide to kill themselves this way don't succeed. I wouldn't be able to, because I'd be too damn thirsty. Just the concept makes it impossible, whether you're sucking on lozenges or having the sip of the vodka and tonic, which was great. And so, and then you go on to Dr. Kevorkian, and the question is, what about the people who don't have enough of a commitment? What is your responsibility as doctors? Dr. Kevorkian felt that it was his responsibility to push that commitment a little further than perhaps he should have. So what do you?
I think it's very, it's interesting to hear Lou's comment about being an observer, and even though he's not a practicing physician now, feeling the ethical, constraints of being a physician. I mean, it's, people think of the word license, it's kind of like, James Bond, license to kill, license gives you license, gives you, expanded ability to do things. But the reality is, licenses like medical license, or, being a lawyer and bar ethical constraints of the bar, or ethical constraints of medicine, actually in many ways impede you, or they constrain you. Impede is the wrong word. They constrain what you're allowed to do because you have to operate within certain kinds of. Now, for example, if Dan, who I didn't know, had developed a medical condition where he couldn't eat and was going to die as a function of that, he could get, artificial feeding or artificial fluids or whatever. But if he chose not to do that, no one would consider that suicide, right? That would be considered a decision. You're letting a disease take its course. So it's really around that issue of, are you doing something decisionally? Are you hastening? Are you getting in the way of a process that's already established, or stopping a process that's already established, or allowing a process to go forward that's already established? And what's the boundary around that process? That really becomes in some sense, I think partly, and maybe Lou, you see it differently, the ethical constraint here, or the legal constraint.
Yeah. I mean, I want to also underline how different Dan was from most people who have dementing illnesses. First, in his recognition that he had a dementing illness. A lot of folk do not. But even more so, he never thought for a moment, and John, I think he'll back this up, that everybody should follow his example and do what he's doing, which is to foreshorten the whole process. He recognized that most people who have these illnesses sort of drift into them and continue to do most everything that's required. And their families look forward to retaining as much of them as they can for as long as they can. Dan was, different in that regards. He had had this experience, he'd made his mind up, and he wanted to put some things into play. One of which, refers to what you just alluded to, which is people can have and should have advanced directives that spell out for them any kind of serious illness that they're going to have. What's the extent of the life-prolonging treatments that they want? Do they want to be hospitalized? Do they want to go into the intensive care unit? Do they want the chest compressions? And so on. And Dan had one of those, spelling out that if perchance he had been ill, he was not going to make use of any of those treatments. He would, I don't know, welcome the natural course of that was being taken or not. But again, before your audience gets upset about this, we're not advocating that folk with dementia or who fear that they're going to have dementia necessarily choose this path. There are lots of paths, but we should be knowledgeable about it. And we should be able to talk about it. And we better talk about it in advance of reaching a point where we no longer can. And Dan never did reach that point, which was one of your questions, Sam. He always retained capacity, and in my journalistic opinion, let alone my psychiatric opinion, to make the decisions that he made, including taking the hard course of stopping eating and drinking.
Yeah,
it's also really important to in this conversation include the social history of how this culture, other cultures deal with death and dying, and particularly around dementias. Up until very recently, the only real cultural accepted response to dementia was shame and silence and pretending that nothing was wrong. That has not ended. That's still very much an accepted way of dealing with dementia. Also, equally important is Dan had a history of looking at very hard realities straight on that the larger culture still continues to look at it sideways at best. He was sexually abused as a child, and he talked about that publicly. He learned to do that. He was gay. He learned to talk about that. He was an alcoholic and drug addict drug addict based on multiple back surgeries and a couple pounds of steel back there. In order to save his own life, to lead a productive life, he had to face all of those things. And part of facing those things is, for him and for many of us, talking about them to normalize it. I came out in 1978. It was not an acceptable thing to do. I learned that I had the necessity of dealing with that in order to save my life. I learned that I had to be able to talk about AIDS. Number one, to raise money from rich people who chose not to look at the subject. So both of us had experience with confronting really difficult subjects before the larger culture approved of our doing so.
It's interesting.
And I think that experience made dealing with death straight on much more easier for Dan.
I haven't heard that before about shame and dementia. Would you have a sense of where that arises from, or what's behind that?
Oh, gee, well, we've long looked at a cancer used to be the C word. I mean, I remember my parents talking about the C word at the dinner table. They, even in the 50s, could not talk about cancer. I don't think there's any institution that has encouraged us to look at these kinds of subjects straight on. Ignorance and shame control so much of what we have a hard time facing, and to extend that just a bit, part of the reason members of his family had such a hard time with this is that they were white, upper middle class people for whom all the rules had been written. And they had, straight, I would add in there, they had no reason to question any of those rules because they benefited from all of them. Dan became an outlier in that family because he tried to force them to look at a number of these subjects. And in many cases, family members were not willing to accept him as a full human being as a result of his life experience.
Well, Lou, I mean, that's part of the issue, but today in our society where we don't even have civil discourse, and IVF is something that idiotically, the idea of a sperm and an egg, as soon as they touch each other, you go to jail for life. I mean, are you pessimistic? Are you cautiously optimistic? Do you have any opinion about whether, as we move along here, this is going to be an area in which there's a certain amount of achievement and progress? Or do you think, no, this is going to get worse?
Oh, no, Sam, I am certainly optimistic. We're talking about it now. We're talking about that taboo subject now. John has just launched into a whole bunch of different ways in which Dan could have been banged down to the ground, and yet he kind of came up and spoke to those issues and more issues. Dan, by the way, was the director of an ACLU for a couple of years, for a number of years as well. And so there were many other social topics that people were just beginning to talk about at that time. Yeah, we'll get there. These laws that don't include dementia will expand to include dementia. Conversations, Dan was exceptional in terms of talking to anyone who cared to listen about his life and about the things that he was going through. Yeah, I'm optimistic.
The thing about it is that I felt that I feel strongly that Dan is a hero, and he, just like a physician would do, he took heroic measures. And what I'm concerned about is say me,
Yep.
if I didn't have, I'd rather be dead. And if I would rather be dead, but I don't have the commitment to do so, the question I'm asking you about the future is, more assistance going to be able to be provided in this country? Because
Yep.
we're not all heroes.
No, we are not. And it's a pluralistic society. So one would like to think that, again, the people who want to live every minute that they can, the people who believe that it is not up to man to make a decision as to when you die, those people can and should be respected for their opinions. And hopefully, and I'd like to think, again, it's the optimism in me. It's just my nature. It's not, I don't have any ball to look into to figure it out. But I think that this too is going to be one of those subjects that the conversation is going to continue.
The interesting thing to me, and the tragic thing is, and you bring it up, I've forgotten who said it in the book, but the idea that, and there's lots of reasons why you might want to end your life. One, you just might be severely depressed. You might have inoperable cancer. But with regard to the dementias, we've had, 40 years of failure.
Yes.
There's nothing that can be done about it. So, you talk about the drugs, most of which I can't pronounce, aducanumab and Leqembi, but they don't really do anything. So drug companies are making a lot of money on these drugs and clinical trials for my father-in-law. But so what's on the horizon? I know it's not your specialty, but what's on the horizon with regard to the possibility of amelioration or halting or remission or any of those things?
The most hopeful thing that I heard actually pertains to AIDS and the original first generation of drugs that came out to treat AIDS, which didn't really do much of anything until the second generation and a third generation came on, and we began to do these combinations that actually turned AIDS from a immediately fatal illness into a chronic illness. We are beginning, I'd say, to see some of that first generational medication stuff. We're beginning to see some advances in genetics, and we're beginning to find some actually correctable things that we can do to ward off the dementias. There's things we can't do. I mean, we know that it happens to old people, and we all want to get old, or most of us want to get old. It happens to more women than men, and we can't exactly alter that. There's a genetic piece to it that we can't, again, probably do much with, although there are some attempts at doing things. But there are some simple things. Probably the most simple thing is to help people to hear better. It turns out that hearing impairment is a correctable factor that contributes to folk developing dementias. Vision may be another, socializing may be another. All those healthy things, eating well and exercising and stuff like that, all seem to, at least statistically, contribute to diminishing the chances of people coming down with a dementia.
Yeah, it's like John was.
I think equally important is talking about it, which is what we're doing now, which is why Dan decided that he wanted to be interviewed by Lou. These subjects only become more acceptable when there's language around them. And as long as we keep silent about these things that we're so terrified of, we make no progress. But when we confront the fear and the ignorance and make talking about how we want the end of our lives to be, that's gonna help tremendously. I mean, that everybody has to come out about talking about the end of their lives, and I think that's a really critical piece in conjunction with what Lou was talking about, the medical aspects of it.
You know,
Yeah,
before we go on.
No, I was
Sorry.
going to say, going back to the issue of shame and shame around dementia, I mean, shame usually implies that you've done something wrong, or that there's something you could have done, and so that the cause of this is due to your own behavior. And that's the way medicine was viewed. Cancer, as you pointed out, John, was viewed that way. Mental illnesses of various kind are still viewed that way. Not all, but many are viewed that way. And I do think that, to the extent that, it doesn't always work this way, but there are things that are emerging, beyond the existing drugs right now, basic science kinds of interventions that are, right now making a difference in mice, but maybe will make a difference in humans. So, I do think that, Lewis Thomas, who is the great writer about medicine from the middle of the 20th century, pointed out that when you really get to fundamental treatments in medicine, they tend to have very few side effects and they work extremely well. I will eventually get there among some of the causes of dementia, and there are many different kinds of dementias, as you were mentioning in the beginning. And so I do think we'll eventually see some shift in that. How we'll see this from a behavioral standpoint, or from a life decisional kind of standpoint, I think is more complicated, unfortunately. So
I think that another way that you can handle this is with sense of humor. My mother and I always laughed at death, and I always think if death is knocking at your door in his black cloak and his scythe, and he hears you laughing about him inside, he just gets really pissed off and leaves. And that's how it was with my mom, who died at 96. She had 2 heart attacks. The second one, she didn't call anyone because she didn't want to bother anybody. Then she's in the hospital and she wakes up in the intensive care and she goes, "Have I kicked the bucket yet?" And the doctor goes, "Somebody get a bucket." And the last year of her life, when the doctor would come in and said, "You have a very stenotic heart," and blah, 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 she would laugh at him. The 3 sons, and me being one, would laugh at him, and he would leave all upset. And then she just enjoyed herself and drank her orange juice and put 13 packets of sugar in it. And 2 hours before she died, my brother was swabbing her with hot chocolate. And then she just fell asleep. But every day she laughed, every day she sang. And I would like to feel that if you can continue laughing until the very end, you've kind of cheated death anyway. There's my story for today.
Thank you, Sam.
Dan did that. Dan had a tremendous sense of humor right up until the troubles with the family began. And that's one of the reasons that I admire him tremendously. Well, there's lots of reasons, but that's his sense of humor about that reality was wonderful.
Yeah, I think the idea of laughing at it is the same kind of thing. It's one of those ameliorative things I was talking about. Yours are kind of technical, Lou, like the idea of getting hearing aids. That's going to make a big difference. I should probably do it. And you, John, staying away from restaurants that are really loud. So, it's a very difficult situation. And Chris Hemsworth's whole idea about stepping back and doing as much as he can to forestall what he sees as inevitable. I don't necessarily agree with that. But I guess in conclusion, because it's well over the hour that you suggested, Lou, I guess we've already talked about the possibilities of some way of getting rid of this disease, if that's what it is. But I think the story you told in this book and in your previous 2 books is the idea that if you're going to be checked out in one way, it's better for you to make the checking out your own process instead of nature's.
In this case, yes. My opinion, but again, not imposing it upon others.
No, totally agreed. But I mean, I think that it's something that, well, okay, well then I guess the question to put you on the spot is and this is what I ask again, Paul, as a bookseller, because it's important not only to sell the book, but to tell people to walk out from behind the counter and talk to them about the book they picked up. This is why you should buy this. So why and what do you think you would like the reader to take away from all 3 of these volumes, and perhaps another one coming up? What do you want me to take away from it then? That puts you on the spot.
It does. It does. Quite simply, we have options that we didn't have perhaps before. We should learn about them and make preparations if we are inclined to make use of them.
So basically, we end with the Boy Scout motto again. That's a good way to end. Well, thank you all three of you for everybody, was really helpful for me because you come at it from different ways, different positions in this story. And I'm so glad that you ended up meeting the right people in order to write it. So
John, my condolences on your loss.
Thank you.
yeah, and you handled it as well, perhaps even better than Dan. Although I don't mean to say it in that way, but you're here and you had to do it. So
yeah, no, he was a gift.
Yeah, that's how I felt about my I sometimes in the store someone will come in and say, "Oh, I'm so sorry about your mother," and I'll start laughing. Horrible, because they're so appalled. But it was like the best death in the world, and she was surrounded by her 3 boys like she had been at the kitchen table 40 years before.
Yeah.
So it's the best I can hope for.
Lucky her.
Yeah, like you said, a gift. Okay.
Thanks.
I guess we're up, and we'll talk again, Lou, next time you come out with another one, and I appreciate it.
Take
Thank
care.
you all.
Bye-bye.